The search for the killer in the yogurt shop murders again spanned nearly 34 years. In the end, it came down to kind of a rapidly unfolding investigation just over the last four months or so.
Yeah, around June. The authorities are expected today to take us inside the investigation. That included new DNA testing, ballistics exams, old-fashioned police work, and luck. Senior reporter Tony Plahetsky joins us now. Tony, you learned many of those details ahead of today's news conference, and now you're telling us more about how police believe they have solved this case. Again, we're talking about back to June, right? So a lot of stuff just kind of fell into place after so many years.
Yeah, involving ballistics, DNA, luck, on-the-ground police work, all of that, authorities say, really worked together to bring these answers. But to your point, Yvonne and Brian, they started really in June with new momentum. Here's how that new momentum began. An investigator from the Austin Police Cold Case Unit decided to re-upload some ballistic evidence that was gathered at the yogurt shop scene that night into a federal database. Yes, they had done that before, but they learned that it was possible that some of those entries maybe fell out of the database. So they said, let's give it a try again. Well, they got a hit, and that hit was to a crime scene in Kentucky where a woman was found shot in the back of a business, and that business was set on fire. So there were these striking similarities to what happened at the yogurt shop. That was the biggest breakthrough this case had seen in years, and it added new energy to this investigation. At that point, investigators reached out to crime labs across the country and asked them if they would be willing to upload into their DNA databases a partial DNA strand called YSTR. This is a male-only strand. And an analyst in South Carolina did that. Apparently, this is a very unusual thing to do within the forensic science community. But they were able to then get the name Robert Eugene Brasher, or Brashear, as it's pronounced differently, and gave that name to Austin Police. And Brian and Yvonne, at that point, this investigation was off to the races.
So had that not happened, we wouldn't be here today.
That's right. And so many people are saying, well, why did it take so long? Well, part of this is that manually keying in, it's called a manual upload of a partial DNA sample, that's something that really just started. I'm told that South Carolina had never done that before using their database, but they decided just, to try it in this particular case. And then again, it matched to Robert Eugene Brasher's. That's important because Brasher in the 1990s had committed 3 other murders according to authorities, both in South Carolina and Missouri. And so that's why he was in their DNA database. As all of this began culminating, though, there was DNA that was from the fingernails of the youngest victim, Amy Ayers. And authorities, once they had something to potentially match it to, tried to see if they could link it to Brasher's. And in fact, I'm told that they did.
Wow.
And again, I said this earlier, but in talking to Bob Ayers, the father of Amy Ayers, and it's important to note the families have been briefed extensively on this. That was all happening on Friday. He told me that he and his family always believed that there would be something about his daughter, something about Amy, that would help solve this case. And he believes that he now has those answers and that, in fact, in his mind, this is over and that this can finally, once and for all, be put to rest.
She held the clue, the final clue, right?
He believes in his heart and in his mind that she absolutely held the final clue. By the way, he pointed this out because investigators pointed it out to him. She was able to get those clues in a fight for her life with the killer.
Amazing.
If she wouldn't have been, putting up resistance.
Exactly.
Also, if you think about it, remember the girls were bound, they were gagged, shot, but there was a fire. So it's also, that there was, they were burned. So if you think about that, to also have that DNA after that fire, I know a lot of people were saying, well, how is that possible if there was, but it was. I mean, it was underneath the fingernails.
But also even going back farther, when you think of 1991, DNA was in its infancy in terms of the ability to solve crimes. And I talked to John Jones, who was the original investigator in this case. And he reminded me that investigators, the medical examiner's office had shown up to the crime scene to take the bodies away. And investigators at the scene, these Austin police investigators, were like, wait. We need Texas DPS to come out here and to collect DNA samples from the bodies of these girls. And had the bodies gone to the medical examiner's office, he believes, without the collection of that DNA, they would have not even had DNA evidence. But yes, one of the reasons that this case was so difficult along the way for investigators is because so much of the evidence was just burned in the fire, obviously by design from the killer.
I'm curious, you've covered many of these. This, of course, a very high-profile crime. Is it unique that all of this evidence was still viable? I mean, it seems to me 34 years ago, DNA, I mean, obviously, I guess DNA lasts forever, but the samples were still there, the ballistics information was still available. How rare is that?
I mean, I think it is rare, but I can also tell you, and I'm not a scientist, of course, but it is my understanding that some of the DNA was, in fact, there was a concern that it was becoming degraded over time. There wasn't that much of it, and so you can't just like test, from what I understand, over a period of decades. You only get a certain amount of tries, and so that is, for example, one of the reasons that they had kind of preserved some of the testing until they actually had a match, hoping that one day they would have a name, they would have DNA from that person, and would be able to, as a last hope, use that DNA to provide a match to a killer.
You mentioned genealogy. So when you're talking about that, again, that didn't really become popular until around 2018.
Yeah,
that's what I think,
exactly,
around 2018. So when you do that, basically it's a mixture of genealogy. When people do, what is it, like
23andMe,
yeah,
like that.
And then you also have DNA testing. But you're right, with every year and as years, advancements in technology, but you also have to think about the cost every time you have to go and retest, But a lot of times, even with cases now, it's interesting because people don't realize, well, why didn't they just test it? Why didn't they go test it then? Well, you never know. A year later or 2 years later, then more information might be in the database system that they can match. Sometimes it's not the right timing. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And in this case, they're like, thank you, South Carolina. Because South Carolina was like, sure, we'll do this. We'll give it a try. And then boom. But to your point, it's genealogy that was able to link, according to authorities, Brasher to these crimes, these previous murders, both in South Carolina and Missouri. And I can tell you what they're doing right now, investigators, not just in Austin, but in other jurisdictions across the country, is they're now starting to go through their own files and say, what cold cases do we have, and retest, and whether or not Brasher may have been responsible for crimes in those communities. I haven't talked about this yet, and I think it is fascinating. Going back in police files, not just in Austin, but across the country, authorities have been able to trace Brasher's traveling from Georgia, where a car he was in was reported stolen, heading west to Texas, and he is believed to have traveled, obviously, through Austin, moving westward to Arizona, possibly to see his father, where his father lived, but stopped in Austin. 2 days after the yogurt shop murders, he was at a border patrol crossing outside of El Paso, about 50 miles outside of El Paso. And they stopped him, they detained him, they confiscated a .380 pistol at that point. And authorities say that that pistol is the same make and model that was used to kill one of the yogurt shop victims. So in their minds, that also places Brasher is in the region, at least, in Texas, moving from east to west when these murders occurred.
So he was just passing through. He had no ties here, and there was no reason for him to be here?
Never lived here, didn't work here. Yeah. There were literally no ties.
Wow. So many questions, though, like, what was your motive? What, you know what I mean? There's just so many unanswered questions, and we won't get those questions answered because he's dead.
Right.
But as far as talking about the wrongful convictions, how many other men had to deal with being wrongfully convicted of something they did not even do?
Yes, so that is one reason that as this news was sort of breaking, there was a sense of, yes, relief, but at the same time, I think the family members will tell you in the back of their mind, like, is this for real? And the reason they sort of had that is because in 1999, they were told that police had solved the case with the arrest of 4 men. 2 of those men went to trial. 2 of them were convicted. 1 of them, and I can't underscore this enough, 1 of them was sentenced to die for the yogurt shop murders. He was on Texas death row before the Court of Criminal Appeals overturned his conviction. But in talking with the families, again, they were briefed extensively on all of this information, all of this evidence, and they are 100% convinced that this is over, that police absolutely have the right person. It'll be interesting to see at the news conference today whether or not police will use the word solved. I mean, the families will 100% tell you that it's solved. But in terms of sort of police lingo, for them, they want to continue the investigation. They're not quite ready to consider it closed yet, because there are other questions, there are other evidence that they just want to kind of, be able to bring in, to tie up, and then 100% at that point close their case.
It's fascinating. I just looked up the population of Austin in 1991, under 500,000. This was a different place then.
Oh, absolutely.
100% a different place. And, people in this particular area, were off Steck or on Steck, and the yogurt shop
It's right
is
down
just
the street.
right down the street. And if you talk to, Judy Maggio and other people who worked here, in between newscasts, they would go to the yogurt shop. So they knew these girls. And I think that was true for so many people. I mean, just going back in time, I'm sure we all remember this, but frozen yogurt was like a huge kind of thing in the early 90s. And so people, the lines would be long, and people would go, visit that shop on a regular basis and got to know the employees there and the store itself, and it was just so horrific and so shocking.
It seems in a sense, the innocence of Austin was kind of lost because it was like, oh, okay. I mean, again, small, it seemed like a very small, more of a quaint town, and then this happened, and so many decades and years of just unanswered questions,
With bad policing, good policing, and all of that, that put the spotlight on all of this too. The operations of the Austin Police Department, how investigators were comporting themselves. The convictions, as we know, were based on false confessions that those men later said were, coerced by Austin police investigators. But again, authorities and family members are ready to really now put the spotlight where they say it belongs, and that is on this serial killer.
Do you think, you mentioned South Carolina and just the pure, not luck, but just great odds were against this happening and the way it went down. Do you think that will now open the doors? You say this guy could be guilty of more and more crime.
Authorities think that.
That's going to open the door for that? You think there are going to be more cases we see?
I think authorities fear that this man may have been responsible for other similar crimes, and so now that's part of the work. They are ready to quickly turn to that and begin investigating other cold cases, not just in Texas, but in other places where this guy we know, may not have even lived, may not have even worked, may have just been traveling through.
And so looking ahead today at 10 a.m., you're saying it's going to be City Hall, because why is it going to be at City Hall, not at APD? There's a reasoning for this press conference, why it's going to be in a larger spot.
There are so many people are expected to come to this news conference. And so the city had to find a venue to be able to host. In addition to that, this is going to be an extensive news conference. This is not something to where they're going to stand up there and say a few remarks and leave. We're talking 7 or so speakers, and they are going to essentially walk us through this vast body of evidence that they say led them to this serial killer. And so this is going to be something that is going to take time. They are going to painstakingly walk us through it, because one of the things that I think investigators also want is for the public to their findings by law enforcement to have credibility with the public, for the public to truly know and understand. They know walking into this that there are going to be skeptics out there who are like, well, you've told us before you've solved this case, so why should we believe you now? And so they're prepared to bring it. They, you know, what do we say? They've got receipts.
Yeah.
So, you know, so they've got,
This is their biggest cold case. When you walk into the, you know, the cold case detective unit, the first thing you see on the right when you walk in, when I walk in, I would see their pictures, and that it's a reminder to them that this case had been unsolved and that they were still working on it. So,
and there's that diagram. Is it a diagram? Is
it's
that what you
like
call
a diagram,
it? Yeah,
like a scale model that they have there in the office as well. But it's been hanging over their heads for 34 years.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah.
Tony, great work.
Thank you.
Thanks for telling us all of that. You'll be there today at 10 o'clock.
I will be.
And we'll join you live to bring that press conference to our viewers. Tony, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Tony Plahetsky following the story. We've got a cut in coming on the TV side. We'll be back with more here on KVUE Plus after that. Stay with us.